Keith Richards said. One string. Just one string. The room fell silent. Jimi smiled and placed his fingers on the guitar. The sound that followed haunted Keith for 40 years. London, 1967. A rehearsal space above a pub on Denmark Street. Small room. Brick walls. Wooden floor worn smooth by decades of musicians pacing, waiting, doubting. A single window letting in gray afternoon light. The kind of light that makes everything look like memory even while it's happening. There were maybe 7 people in that room. Keith Richards. Jimi Hendrix. A few session players whose names time forgot. A roadie. Someone's girlfriend sitting in the corner with a notebook. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the particular tension that comes when great musicians gather in small spaces. They'd been playing for maybe an hour. Loose. Exploratory. The way musicians do when there's no audience, no pressure, just the conversation that happens through instruments instead of words. Keith had been watching Jimi. Everyone always watched Jimi. But Keith wasn't watching like a fan. He was watching like someone trying to understand a language he didn't speak. How do you do that? Keith had asked earlier, after Jimi finished a run that seemed to turn the Stratocaster into 3 different instruments at once. Jimi hadn't answered directly. He never did. Just smiled that small smile and said, "The guitar tells you. You just have to listen." Keith nodded like he understood, but his face said otherwise. His face said what everyone's face said around Jimi, "I'm good at this. I've worked for years at this. And I still don't understand what I'm watching." The session had continued. More playing. Less talking. Until Keith stopped and set down his guitar with the deliberate care of someone making a decision. "Jimi," Keith said, his voice carrying that particular edge of someone about to test something. "I want to try something." Jimi looked up. Waiting. Play something. But only use one string. The room got quieter. Not silent, it was already quiet, but a different kind of quiet. The kind where everyone suddenly becomes aware they're witnessing something. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Jimi looked at his Stratocaster. Then at Keith. That small smile appeared again. Not mockery. Not even amusement, really. Something closer to recognition. Like he'd been expecting this question eventually. "Which string?" Jimi asked. Keith hadn't expected that response. He'd expected resistance, maybe? Or clarification. Not a practical question that accepted the premise completely. "Doesn't matter," Keith said. "Your choice." Jimi stood up. Walked to his guitar case in the corner. Opened it, and pulled out wire cutters. The kind guitar techs use for changing strings. No one spoke. Jimi returned to his stool. He positioned the Stratocaster across his lap. Then, methodically, without ceremony, he cut the high E string. The small ping of metal giving way. Then the B string. Another ping. Then the G, the D, the A. 5 small sounds like a countdown to something nobody in that room could imagine yet. Only the low E string remained. Hanging there on the guitar like the last thread holding together something that should have collapsed. Keith's cigarette had stopped moving halfway to his mouth. The session players had stopped their side conversation. The girlfriend in the corner had stopped writing. Even the roadie, who'd seen everything, was staring. Jimi tested the string. Tuned it slightly. His fingers moved with the same casual precision they always did. Like this wasn't remarkable. Like he hadn't just rendered 5/6 of his instrument silent. He looked up at Keith. "Ready?" Keith nodded. His throat had gone dry. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Jimi's right hand moved. One finger. One string. And a note emerged from the Stratocaster that shouldn't have been possible. Not just a note, a voice. Deep and resonant, and somehow full despite coming from a single vibrating wire. He let it sustain, bending it slightly, making it speak. Then his left hand began to move along the fretboard. Sliding. hammering on and pulling off with a fluidity that turned limitation into language. The single string became a conversation. Question and answer. Call and response. The acoustic sound of gut and wood and metal combining into something that filled the small room like smoke. He played for maybe 45 seconds. No effects. No amplifier. Just his hands and one string and the particular genius that separates those who play music from those who are music. When he stopped, the note faded slowly into the cigarette haze and afternoon light. Jimmy's hands rested on the guitar. His expression unchanged. Like he just demonstrated something obvious that everyone should have already known. Keith Richards, who had played with some of the greatest guitarists alive, who had crafted riffs that defined rock and roll, who was not a man easily impressed, stood perfectly still with his mouth slightly open. Jesus Christ! Someone whispered. Maybe the roadie. Maybe one of the session players. Maybe everyone at once. Keith set down his cigarette in an ashtray without looking at it. He walked over to where Jimmy sat. Slowly. Like approaching something sacred that might disappear if you moved too fast. How? Keith's voice had lost all its earlier challenge. It was just a question now. Pure. Simple. Jimmy looked at the guitar. It's not about how many strings you have. It's about listening to the one that's there. Keith stared at him. Processing. Then he started to laugh. Not mockery. Recognition. The laugh of someone who's just been taught a lesson so profound it bypasses the brain and hits somewhere deeper. I've been playing guitar for 15 years. Keith said, still laughing, but his eyes were wet. 15 fucking years. And you just showed me I don't know anything. You know plenty, Jimmy said quietly. You just forgot to listen. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Keith sat down on the floor. Just dropped right there onto the worn wooden boards. He pulled his own guitar into his lap and stared at it like seeing it for the first time. Do it again, Keith said. Please. I need to understand. Jimmy played again. Different this time. Slower. More space between notes. Letting Keith hear not just what he was playing but what he wasn't playing. The silence between sounds. The breathe between phrases. The girlfriend in the corner had started writing again. Fast. Like trying to capture something before it evaporated. One of the session players, a bass player named Martin who'd worked with everyone from The Who to the Kinks, leaned over to the drummer beside him and whispered, "We're watching someone from the future." The drummer nodded. He'd stopped playing entirely 20 minutes ago. Just sat behind his kit watching Jimmy's left hand move along that single string, creating melodies and harmonies and textures that should have required 6 strings and 3 guitars and possibly divine intervention. Jimmy played for another 2 minutes. Building complexity from simplicity. Showing that limitation wasn't absence, it was focus. That mastery wasn't about having more tools. It was about understanding deeply the tools you had. When he finished, he looked at Keith. Want to try? Keith looked at his own guitar. Then at the wire cutters Jimmy had set on the floor. He picked them up. Held them for a moment. Then carefully, deliberately, he cut 5 strings from his Gibson, leaving only the low E. His hands shook slightly as he positioned the guitar. He played a note. It sounded thin. Naked. He tried a simple blues run. It fell apart halfway through, the single string exposing every hesitation, every moment of doubt his normal playing could hide behind 6 strings and distortion. He stopped. Looked at Jimmy. It doesn't sound like that when I do it. Not yet, Jimmy said. But it will. Keith tried again. Better this time. Not good. Not anywhere close to what Jimmy had done. But better. More intentional. Less desperate. Jimmy stood and walked over. He didn't take the guitar. Didn't demonstrate. Just knelt beside Keith and placed one hand on Keith's shoulder. Don't try to make it sound like 6 strings, Jimmy said softly. Let it sound like 1 string. That's all it wants to be. Keith closed his eyes, took a breath, played again. The room heard it. That shift. Subtle but unmistakable. Keith had stopped fighting the limitation and started living inside it. The notes became simpler but more true. Less impressive but more honest. When Keith opened his eyes, there were tears running down his face. "I've been performing," he said. "All this time, I thought I was playing music, but I was just performing." Jimi nodded. Said nothing. Sometimes silence teaches better than words. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. The session ended maybe an hour later. People packed up instruments slowly. Nobody wanted to leave. Like walking out of that room would break some spell that hadn't been named yet. Keith and Jimi stood by the window, not talking. Just existing in the grey London afternoon light with their guitars resting against the wall, 5 strings cut from each, like matching scars. "Thank you," Keith said finally. "For what?" "For not being nice about it." Keith smiled, tired but genuine. "You could have just played normally and said something encouraging. But you showed me the truth instead." "That's rarer." Jimi looked out the window at Denmark Street below. Musicians hurrying between studios. Taxis honking. London being London. "Someone did it for me once," Jimi said. "When I was starting out. A blues player in Nashville. I was showing off, playing fast, trying to prove something. He stopped me mid-solo and said, 'Son, speed ain't music. It's just running away.' Then he played one note. Just one. And held it for maybe 10 seconds. And I heard everything. Pain and joy and time and loss and hope. All in one note. Changed everything for me." "What was his name?" Keith asked. Jimi smiled. "I don't remember. I don't even remember what he looked like. But I remember that note." Keith understood. Some teachers aren't people. They're moments. The girlfriend in the corner, her name was Sarah, and she wrote for Melody Maker, would later publish a small piece about that afternoon. She titled it, "The Day Keith Richards Went to School." It ran on page 7 and most people skipped over it. But those who read it remembered. Martin, the session bass player, told the story at a dinner party in 1982. Someone at that party told someone else. Eventually it reached a guitar magazine that printed it in an interview. Keith asked about it, just smiled and said, "Best lesson I ever had." The roadie kept the 5 strings Jimi had cut. Saved them in a small envelope. When he retired in 1993, he donated them to a guitar museum in Cleveland. They're in a display case now, next to a placard that reads, "From the one-string session. London, 1967. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered." Keith Richards never forgot. Years later, decades later, he'd be in the studio working on a Stones track and someone would suggest adding more guitars, layering more sounds, filling every space with noise. And Keith would stop them. "No," he'd say. "Listen to what we have first. Make sure every note matters." Jimi taught me that. People who weren't there didn't understand. But the ones who were, the ones who'd watched a master cut away everything unnecessary and reveal that music lived in simplicity, not complexity, they understood perfectly. The guitar with one string. The lesson without words. The afternoon in a small room when Keith Richards learned that real mastery wasn't about playing more. It was about needing less. And in that understanding, in that moment of ego breaking and rebuilding into something truer, Keith Richards stopped being just a great guitarist. He became a student again. Jimi restrung his guitar before he left. All 6 strings back in place. But Keith kept his guitar with one string for 3 more days. Practiced. Listened. Learned what silence could teach. On the 4th day, he restrung it. But he never played the same way again. Years later, a young guitarist asked Keith for advice. "How do I get better?" Keith smiled. Remembered that afternoon. That room. That lesson. "Cut 5 strings," he said. "And learn what one can do. The young guitarist laughed, thinking it was a joke. Keith didn't laugh back. Jimi Hendrix died 3 years after that session. Keith never got to thank him properly. But he carried the lesson for 50 years. Still carries it. The one-string afternoon. The day mastery wore the face of mercy. The moment Keith Richards learned that real power whispers.